everyone. Welcome back to The Graded Escape. I'm Kelly.
And I'm Anna.
And today is episode 3 of our 4-part mini-series, which we have titled When to Worry About Reading Delays and When Not to. This is a big one that we come across in the homeschool community where parents start to feel a little bit anxious about their child maybe not making progress the way they thought they would. Should they be concerned about some sort of formal reading diagnosis? So we're here today to help unpack all of that for you. Recognize the difference between normal variations in early reading development and signs of a potential reading difficulty such as dyslexia. And my lovely co-host Anna is going to take us into a lot of the different types of reading disorders that are out there, as well as some strategies for how a reading specialist might intervene in those cases. So, okay.
Yes. So we were going to kind of do a quick note on dyslexia, because that's usually the most common reading disorder that gets thrown out there. Mm-hmm. And usually that's what parents, like the moment a kid's struggling with reading, it's like, oh my gosh, well, are they dyslexic?
Yeah.
And
well, I think too, like in society, it's just one of those things. I mean, I kind of feel like it's this way with autism too, of just like, oh, I must be autistic. It's like, oh, yeah, I reverse my B's and D's. Oh, that's just my dyslexia.
Yeah.
Like there's a misnomer about what it is actually. Mm-hmm. And because I think it's just used so loosely in society at times to describe any sort of like reading or spelling challenges.
Right. Yeah. And it's also kind of the idea of, this is something that's hard for your kid. And for a lot of kids, reading when they get to that point is normally one of the first, I think we've talked about this before in other episodes, but it's like one of the first times that you might see your child struggle. Up until that point, they might be pretty good, with phonemic awareness or phonics or whatever, and they got their letters and sounds and and now they're putting it into practice, and like all of a sudden it's stagnant, or they're, hitting resistance and this is hard, and all of a sudden you're like, well, but this it is hard. I mean, it is a challenging thing for kids to learn. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's jumping to some kind of a reading disorder. And it's not the only one. So we go into talking about some other reading challenges that kids can present with. But just a quick note on dyslexia first, because that may be something that if you're watching and you think that this applies to your child, or you had it yourself growing up and, so you're convinced your child has it. So I wanted to mention that the actual DSM-5 definition of dyslexia is a neurobiological disorder characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition, poor spelling, and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in phonological components of language. So this is a neurobiological disorder. It's not like, oh, you just did poor instruction, so your kid developed dyslexia. Like, no, this was going to be something that was predetermined already. Your kid's not going to get dyslexia because, you did a couple years of poor instruction. That's not how dyslexia forms. So what kids with dyslexia often, have is they do have a lot of trouble connecting letters to sounds. So remembering, like, if you look at a letter, what's the sound that it makes? They forget. They see that it's B, but they don't remember it makes B. It's a hard connection. They don't make that connection very easily.
And I'll just interject here that if you have not watched our first episode, which is the 5 pillars of reading instruction, definitely go back and give that a watch, because in that one we break down all of these components that maybe we're talking about. So if you're, you jump ahead and you really want to watch this one, that's great. But if you're confused a little bit by what we mean by like phonological awareness or phonemic awareness, give that episode a listen so that you kind of know a little bit more of what we mean when we say those terms.
Yeah. Okay. Very good point. They really struggle to sound out unfamiliar words. So this is a very common thing that I would see working with kids, where kids with dyslexia often try to start memorizing things or looking at the pictures to sort of decide like what that word says. So they see a picture of a cat, they look at CAT, and now they're like cat. But if you were to make, we used to call them like alien words or, silly words. Nonsense words, whatever. And you start changing out vowels or changing out consonants. So now the word isn't a word that's an actual word anymore. So now I'm going to blank on one. Instead of cat, you would change the E, make it E, and it'd be ket, C-E-T. They have to sound that out. Could they do that? There's not a picture to go with it. It's not a word that they're familiar with because it's an alien word. They really can't do that. You see a real block in their ability to do that. Usually really poor spelling develops. I mean, even with very familiar words. So even if they are reading out cat because they're connecting to the picture, but then they went to go spell it, it would not translate into their writing. And understand stories better when they're heard aloud versus when they're reading independently. That's somewhat true for most early readers, however. So, there's mostly kids understand stories a lot better when they're beginning readers and they aren't actually reading it themselves or just listening. So that does apply to a lot of kids, that last one. So it's technically part of the dyslexia process, but it's also that last one can be.
Right. It's like the only part of it. So if you're, like, oh, well, they might have a little trouble with this or sounding in unfamiliar words. Oh, no, they don't. They definitely understand stories better when heard. We're not saying that means that your child has dyslexia.
No, it's got to have all the, looking at all the other ones prior to that, that would be right.
Yeah.
But yeah, their oral language, their reasoning skills, all that stuff is above or on average. I mean, this is how the brain processes sound. This has nothing to do with your child being lazy or, not driven or anything like that. It's got nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's a brain processing language issue. And, phonological awareness, rapid naming, working memory, and processing speed, those are all things that are kind of looked at when the child is officially evaluated for dyslexia. So it's not caused by vision problems, like I said, laziness, lack of instruction, anything like that. So you're not going to cause your child to have dyslexia by doing something when you're teaching them.
I actually like the part in here that it's not caused by vision problems. So just kind of as like a little aside, if you are noticing that your child is having some significant issues with like letter naming or sound, things like that, and their vision hasn't been tested in a while, that might be a nice, just coming from that background, like a medical rule out, just to ensure that they can see things properly, because you never know, like it could just be a little fix like that could solve the problem. Maybe it's not necessarily a reading deficit at all. Maybe it's just a vision.
Yeah, I mean, and that rings true for me. I have 2 children who have severe eye issues, and so we do a lot of work to make the materials that they're looking at blown up, dark font, certain colors, and you'd be surprised there are a lot of kids that have certain variations of that, not always as much as my children do, but but might have some, I can remember there was a teacher once that I was watching, kind of coaching, and she had all these really pretty rainbow markers for the board. And she used to, like, when she wrote up on the board, using all these different really pretty colors. And I remember thinking, like, that's nice. That looks really nice, but like anytime she used light green or a light orange or whatever, like she was so into like making it colorful and looked good. But I was like, your kids back here can't see that. Like that, blacks, blues, even like a dark red sometime, but like that, yes, it's not as colorful or, sort of whatever. But I remember thinking, like, you got to go with the darker color because you just don't know. It's hard to see back here. So signs by stage. So, the formal diagnosis of dyslexia doesn't normally occur until much later. All right, so signs by stage. And again, this is general because this is based off of kids that would be in school. So if you're thinking about this is what they'd be exposed to at this age, if you're homeschooling, it's a whole different ballgame because you may decide not to start this kind of work with your child until they're older. So, take it with a grain of salt, but based off of the trajectory of, children in school, when they're preschool level, you're doing nursery rhymes, you're playing around with rhyming a lot, like cat and bat and sat, like you're doing kind of funny rhymes, kind of guess the next rhyme in the sequence, stuff like that, and it's not clicking. Like I mentioned before, if you're doing any kind of sound with letters at this point, connecting the sound to the letter, and they're not remembering it, not retaining it, after multiple times, about a week's worth of probably exposing them to it, that would be something to look at. Kindergarten, first grade-ish age, you start when they're really doing more with letter sounds and simple words, starting to remember high frequency words. They're starting to blend sounds together. And again, it's not clicking. Every time you sit with them, it's almost like it's this, you've never done it before. And like you might have just worked on blending a CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant word, for 2 weeks, and then they come in after a weekend and it's like, you've never done this before. I mean, it's like a real block. And you're going to see most kids usually at this stage are starting to present like a real frustration because they know that they've done this before, but they know they aren't remembering it, retaining it. And you start to see that frustration going up. By grades 2 and 4, reading is often slow and effortful, and they avoid reading aloud. You see a lot of kids that don't want to do any kind of reading aloud, or even sharing any of their own work that requires them to read what they've written, anything like that. Older students often read accurately but slowly, struggle with spelling still, written expression, and definitely foreign languages. So these are kids who have even gotten intervention, but they're just older. It depends when they got the intervention, that they might still be considered a slower reader. I'd say there's a lot of adults that I know who have dyslexia that were diagnosed probably late elementary, and they would consider themselves pretty slow readers. They don't know if they received the same kind of intervention that is there today. Probably not. So, it kind of depends when the intervention takes place.
Right.
So generally those are kind of the guidelines, but a formal diagnosis is not going to happen until usually the end of first grade. And there's multiple reasons for this, but to be really reliable, they don't want to do it until, like, the longer you wait, almost the better, because it'll be the most reliable results. So that's the like catch-22, but you don't want to wait too late because then you've missed a window. Right, so they want to wait. Say the end of first grade is usually a good benchmark. If they're wanting to test for dyslexia in kindergarten, you're going to get some data, but you're more likely to get more by the end of first grade because they've had at least one full year of reading instruction, and not every kindergarten room, that looks the same. But by the end of first grade, you could pretty much bank on a full year of direct reading instruction. And they are continuing on with the same difficulties that I've mentioned: word reading, spelling, phonics, despite all the extra support. So usually around the age of 6.5, 7.5, and the difficulties aren't just, a lag or they're a little behind, but they'll catch up, just taking a little bit longer. It's kind of past that. It's really clear and persistent that there's an issue and a struggle going on. That's when an intervention would take place, where you would then end up having the child evaluated to get a formal diagnosis, and then they would hopefully end up being paired with a reading specialist for them to work with.
Now, in terms of looking at that data, would they expect to see any progress, or just like really limited, minimal progress despite the year-long intervention?
I mean, both. I would say normally by the end of, there are some first graders that, I've worked with and have seen that are still, letter and letter sound recognition is still not there.
Yeah. Okay.
And then there's others where that's pretty, certain ones they get, about half the alphabet they get. Yeah. Blending certain, again, words that they've seen a lot because they're relying on some memorization tactics and stuff. Okay. So, it's kind of, every kid is very different with that. Yeah. When it comes to
I would just be curious, just from like a data perspective, just like sort of what would meet the mark of like making progress and what wouldn't. But that's a different conversation for a different day. Yeah, I was just
very good question though. Like once they start working with a reading specialist, how do you gauge what the progress is?
Right.
So once they have a dyslexia diagnosis, the kids with dyslexia benefit the most from a very structured literacy program. So this is where, a reading specialist has specific training in how to do this. It's a systematic, explicit, multisensory program, such as like Orton Gillingham, Wilson, Barton. There's similar programs like that. These are specific programs that not the average classroom teacher is trained in. Some are, like there are some schools, I know some private schools that literally have trained all of their elementary teachers in Orton Gillingham. They're still using Orton Gillingham in a group structure though. This is using that method with a small, small group or even one-on-one.
Yeah, some of the classrooms that I've been into, the model for the school, if you think about it, like your response to intervention, where like your whole group instruction gets a little bit, but it's not that intensive, explicit instruction. I think of like Wilson, like the foundations, like cards, you know what I mean? With like the A, apple, everybody was taught that way, right? Yeah. Everybody had the early learning classrooms all had those letters up.
Right.
Just sort of best practice, but they weren't receiving some of that like really intensive.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of elementary classrooms you'll have the alphabet up, but it's rare that a teacher is still going through, after first grade, if even in first grade, and they're kind of, looking at the letter, what's the sound that it makes. Right. That's normally not part of just the regular routine. You get to upper, or even first and second grade. Yeah. So that's part of it. Regular phonemic awareness and phonics practice. So more practice than even the other kids are getting in that. You're still looking at sounds or letters and the sounds, and you're still practicing that. Their support in reading fluency and spelling, so accommodations can be made often for them, like extra time, access to audiobooks or text-to-speech tools. So if they are trying to keep pace with certain types of projects in the classroom, or wanting to be studying the same thing, and but they're not able to read the book yet themselves. They might have access to an audiobook version, or be given extra time because maybe they're going to read it with the reading specialist, and so it's going to take them 2 weeks to read it instead of 1. Or if they're also writing something, some kind of a writing report or response to something, they might. I mean, a teacher that only does text to speech to text tools, like, I would say that's not good because they're not getting any practice. But I have seen it utilized where like they do a portion of the writing and then it's added on with the text.
Right. That was what I was going to say. And I think that like the accommodations piece is really important. Like this is so that this would probably be for maybe a child that's a little bit older, right? In order to kind of continue to access the general education curriculum, things like science or social studies or history, those types of things. Yeah, they're listening to an audiobook, but that's in addition to this direct, systematic, explicit instruction. Right. It's just so that they're able to access the curriculum and make progress in those other areas while they're receiving this intensive support.
Right. So it has to be
not in place.
It's not a place of, because and that's unfortunately what you have seen happen is that due to a lack of resources or parents wanting to get their kids tested, dyslexia is also another one of those very I don't know what the right word is. A lot of parents are very fearful of it. It's like a really scary diagnosis, so they would rather do anything than actually go through the formal testing to find out if their kid has it. That I don't personally understand that. I would be a parent that usually I would want to find out what's going on with my kid, but I know that there are a lot of parents that fearful of a label. Yeah, I'm sure like with an autistic label, same kind of thing. It's like, well, I don't want them to be labeled with dyslexia because that's going to follow them through their whole life. It's like, well, do they have that challenge? Sure, but wouldn't you rather them get the support that they need for it? If you don't, there are times where that label, so to speak, is necessary for them to get the help they need, and to me, that's worth it. But that's my opinion. So that definitely is. Hopefully, that gave you a little bit of insight into the dyslexia diagnosis as a whole, what it is and what it isn't, and it is only one of several reading issues that can occur. And again, just to really drive it home that this is nothing based off of what you have done or an educator has done. I mean, this is a neurobiological issue. Like this would be there regardless. So so it's really nothing, because I know some people think, or parents that I've worked with, they're like, oh, well, if I put them in this program when they were little and maybe. I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. Right. So anyway, so that going into our 4 main categories of reading issues, the first one, which we had to kind of go through, is dyslexia, the word reading decoding disorder. And again, hopefully you got some of your questions answered about how that looks, how it presents itself, and then the kind of the plan that a child would receive on that diagnosis. And if you're a homeschooling parent and your child has dyslexia, there are definite curriculums that are Orton Gillingham or Wilson aligned. However, if you are not a trained reading specialist on how to do, there is a real training that goes into supporting kids with dyslexia instruction that I do think is really valuable. So depending on who you are as a person, your willingness to learn and study and whatnot, and your child, if you felt that we're at a point where we should probably enlist the help of a tutor, there are lots of reading specialist tutors out there as well. So that would not be something to shy away from if you were a homeschooling parent. Right. So I would throw that out there.
Yeah, and I think with dyslexia too, it feels like that's the only real reading disorder that people are aware of, right? That the general public is typically aware of is, if you have any sort of challenge with reading, it's because you're dyslexic. But there are actually 3 other ones that we're going to chat about. And so the next one would be a reading fluency disorder. So the core issue with a reading fluency disorder is that, the learner can read accurately, but they read too slowly and without expression. So as kids get more comfortable with, decoding and all that kind of stuff, they should be able to pick up the pace because a lot of these words they've seen before, the decoding comes a little bit faster through all of that repeated practice. But then you get some kids that they just are still, it's very laborious, right? It's like the dog went to the it's like, okay, this should be a little bit faster, or without expression. They're maybe not paying attention to the punctuation, the question marks, and these again come a little bit later. So in the beginning, it is going to sound very laborious because they're still working on these core skills of decoding, just trying to pull from their memory, like, okay, what does that say? Or maybe some different cutting patterns for trying to decode a word, all of that kind of stuff. But you would say probably by end of second, third grade, that's where you should really see okay, the core of your, reading instruction is kind of done. You've kind of learned to read, and now your fluency should pick up a little bit more. So kids can sound out words correctly, but like I said, it's very choppy, or they start reading, but then there's no pause where the period is. So it's like Jack and Sam went to the store with it's just very, there's not the pause where there should be.
There's that's actually one that my son Leo would have, where he would for a while it took a lot of practice to realize that you have to go to the end, when you see that period. And this was a method that I would use when I had kids with this sort of issue. And for Leo, he moved through it pretty quickly, but I remember it was because he would read to the end of the line.
Right, and then stop.
And be like, but Sam went where? I'm like, what? Was that the end of the sentence? I'm like, where's the period? Yeah. And he's like, oh, it's down there. Oh, Sam went to the market. Oh, okay, we'll see. Right, but then it would be the next sentence would be the same thing. It took him a solid, 2 weeks of doing a lot of practice, highlighting where the period was, the punctuation, and kind of even using his finger to go through and see where the sentences were first. A little bit of that intervention, about 2 weeks worth, where he, kind of jumped over that hurdle of it. But for a while there, it was so funny because he'd get to the end of the line and just be like, the cat sat.
Right.
Cat sat later, Mom. I'm like,
because they're so used to in those early readers, it's all in one line, right? Yeah. And then when they move up a little bit, it's it's great, but now it's in this maybe a little paragraph form, and you've got to it's something that we all take for granted. We know, but there sometimes does need to be that instruction. So, and then they also have some difficulty maintaining the comprehension because of their slow pace, right? So they're just reading so slowly that nothing really is making a lot of sense. And again, there's that labor that's going into it, that their brain is kind of working hard to decode and do all of that, but so they're losing some of the comprehension. And then it can be linked to dyslexia, but it also can be linked to just, some difficulties in processing speeds, how quickly they can process information, see the text on the page, put it in their brain, do what they need to do, and then that output.
And that, I think, is actually really, I love when I see a teacher give a child time to answer a question, because it's so often it's a child doesn't have an immediate response. I have seen so many kids or teachers that I've worked with before who have brought up well, maybe there's a processing issue because of that very thing. The kid needs a minute or two to think before they answer a question. And it's how, that is so normal. I mean, you're I mean, not to mention, think about a kid who's in a classroom. If they're a shy child and you're, having to respond, that is something to take into account. They're speaking, in front of everybody and to the teacher. They want to formulate their thoughts. I used to always say sometimes, at the beginning of the school year, I used to spend some time practicing, where we sit and think with our thought before we respond. So sometimes I'd even ask a question and be like, no hands can come up for a minute, because I would want them to sit and think with what the answer was. Because sometimes kids will just throw up their hands, not even knowing.
Put their hand up just to put their hand up.
Yeah, and same thing, especially when you're homeschooling, you've just got your one kid in front of you and you're talking in the conversation. It's wait a minute, nope, we're all just going to pause for a second. I want you to think about that question and a solid minute before we respond. And so sometimes I think that I've seen that a bigger emphasis on kids needing to process faster, that I don't really think is realistic. I think we've done that over the past, couple decades, probably, that push of processing quicker. All of a sudden it's got to be quick.
Well, you see it even in following directions, right? Owen, go put your shoes on. And it's if he doesn't get up and go right away, it's
what's wrong?
Oh, go put your shoes on. Go put your shoes on. Go put your shoes on. Whoa. He is not... he heard you say something, but he needs time to process. Kids need time to process. I think there was something that, I don't know where I saw it, and I couldn't even tell you, but it was something where it was based on how old they are, they, you need to give them a good 10 to 15 seconds before you say anything again. And I was doing that for a little while with Owen. And it really worked. I would say it, and then I would count to 10, and I'd be like, did you hear what I said? And then he say, oh yeah, I did this or this, you told me to do this. Okay. Like, why don't you go do that? Or like, because they're not ignoring you, right? Maybe you didn't even hear what I said, but yeah, I agree that there's like this need for them to, as soon as you give them the direction, they've got to get up and go. And I don't know how many adults are like that, but
yeah, no, I mean, I'm
very many.
I'm definitely not. If you're struggling with that,
Yeah.
or you think your kid has some processing, speed issues, I would before, and they might, but I would definitely use a method of sort of like asking a question and no response for 30 seconds or a minute or whatever.
Right.
And, that's kind of the rule of thumb. Or give the question, have them repeat to you the question so you know that they have heard it, and then give the 30 seconds or something, and see if that makes a difference. Because in my experience, a lot of times it does. And it's not, so then instead of it being an issue or a disorder or something that needs to be fixed, it's like, no, they just need it's a reasonable, honestly, amount of time to say something. And so I think that's really important.
So kind of we got off track, but that's okay. Like circling back to like what an intervention would look like for a kid that has a reading fluency disorder. You would need just practiced oral reading with feedback. So that's just, a reading aloud, maybe reading the same passage aloud, just, several different times. Changing up the punctuation marks sometimes will help too. Like read it as a question, read it as an exclamation point, read it with a period. Or just telling like, okay, now read it like it says, she said it sadly. So try reading it like that, right? Just practice. And you can make that kind of fun. Excitedly. So let's read it now excitedly. What would that sound like? So it's just a bunch of just practice.
And I would add that practice that you're doing should be with a book that's at a very attainable level for them. It's not a book that they're struggling with some of the words, or it's not your instructional text that you just learned a rule and now there's a story to go with it. You're looking back to like books that they can sit and have practiced. The words in them are very are tangible for them in that moment. It shouldn't be a high level book, even if they can read higher. If they want to do this practice, this this oral rereading and all that, it should be at a level that's extremely comfortable for them, not a high
right, because that takes the work out of it a little bit, right? So like you don't have to worry about decoding, right? Your emphasis now is on your fluency and your speed, and your expression. And then, using timed readings, phrase cued reading, guided oral practice, taking turns reading, like those types of things definitely, can help with, a reading fluency disorder.
And if you're wondering what timed readings are, so timed readings are when you would have like a passage with your child and you set the timer for a minute and they start going through and seeing how far they get and they mark it. And then the next day you do it again and you see if they got any farther. And so it's really an exciting thing for them if they, as they're rereading the same sentence. It could be a paragraph, little story. It could be, it doesn't need to be, I wouldn't do it like a book. I would print out like a page that's got a story on it, that they read, right? And so you set the timer, maybe you do 2 minutes. It depends on the level that your child's at as far as how long they can sit and read for. But I would start with a minute and then see where they get. And then, use a fun color and mark it. And then the next day, start again, set the timer and see even if they got a word farther or all they're trying to do is beat their prior score. So, that's what a timed reading is. And then they just see how like, oh my gosh, I got through half the story in a minute. Like, however it is. And then when it comes to a phrase cued reading, that would be something like that. You've got a text and they've got a text. It works often, with that, but where you're looking at if a character, it's usually mostly with conversation, if a character is speaking, like in what tone they'd be speaking. So prior to reading the page, you kind of are looking at the scenario of the character, how might they be speaking? And so you're trying to use a lot of expression with these cues. And so sometimes you look for certain words that show how the character might be feeling or portraying these words, like if they were actually in conversation. So that's just if you want a little more insight into what those actually meant. So
thank you for that.
So that's reading fluency disorder, and a reading specialist might work with a child for that, but mostly it's not something you couldn't do as a parent or as a classroom teacher. It's just the classroom teacher would not have the time to do this work and maintain the classroom. That's why they would be taken out with it for a reading specialist for this. Now,
and then I'm just going to interject a little bit here and just talk a little bit about the difference between fluency and accuracy, because I think this is a really important thing. So some of you might be thinking about like, okay, well, what does it matter? Like if they can read it accurately, why does it matter if they're doing it a little bit slower than what is to maybe be expected. And I always like to use the example of like shoe tying, right? So like, let's say you give your kid a passage and you don't time how long it takes, and they read it, right? And they got everything right, but it took them, 10 minutes to maybe read like 5 sentences. And I think that like, okay, if I can tie my shoe and I can do it with 100% accuracy, but it takes me 30 minutes to tie my shoe, that's not feasible, right? So you need the fluency piece, right? Everything that we do in our day-to-day, that we need to you have to be fluent in it, right? You have to be able to do it not only accurately, but also with speed. So that's where the fluency piece comes in, especially because as they start to move from, which we'll talk about in a little bit, like this phase of learning to read to learn, it is not feasible for them to be able to, for it to take 45 minutes to read a page of a science book, right? Or something like that, unless they're taking like copious notes or something like. But like, so that's where the fluency piece comes in. And if you're really struggling to think about like, well, why does it matter, just think about the shoe tying.
It's a great example.
Because right, you could do it with 100% accuracy, but if it takes you significantly longer than it maybe should, then it's just not feasible. It's not able to be maintained. So I just wanted to interject that.
It's a great example. It's a great example.
So reading fluency disorder, and then the next one would be reading comprehension disorder. So here, now we've got a kid that they can read fluently, right? They're pausing at their punctuation marks. They're maybe reading with expression. They're decoding, right? But they don't remember or understand anything about what was read, right? So they've read this passage, a story about Jack and Jill, and they went up the hill, and then you ask them after, like, oh, who went up the hill?
Right.
So again, what it looks like, they are able to decode those words. They miss the meaning of things. They struggle with some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in our next episode, which is what is reading comprehension. Skills like making inferences, so being able to figure out what's going on without being explicitly told, summarizing, so going back and telling like, hey, what happened? What happened first? What happened next? What happened last? Connecting ideas. So this is usually linked to broader like language comprehension or working memory. Weaknesses. So, if your child also has a hard time maybe with some comprehension, when it's like oral comprehension, right? So receptively they're accessing the information that you're telling them, but they can't maybe repeat it back. That also might be an indicator that there could be some sort of underlying disorder.
And that's why checking for comprehension with your kids, even if they're reading really fast, and like this definitely comes into play. I've had kids who would come to me like 3rd grade level that had been like fluent, strong readers starting in like the first month of 1st grade. And so they just flew through everything because they were reading so quick. And then I would get them, and 3rd grade is a pretty pivotal point where we've talked about where you're going from learning to read to reading to learn. So now they're reading off the charts, but when I'm stopping and asking them a question and they're like blank faced, I'm like, whoa, this is where you hit this reading comprehension disorder that often is masked because the teacher's not checking for fluency and comprehension from day one. Because comprehension, you can ask comprehension questions starting from kindergarten. I mean, we'll get into that and how you do that. But it's not just about being able to read it, because there are kids that will pick up on how to read and they are not retaining, remembering at all, and that's being completely blindsided because the teacher's just so excited that they're reading so well. And they're like, because such a great reader, that is a part of it, and yay for them that they can read. But if they're not able to retain or remember anything that they're reading, then you're missing out on a massive chunk of that. And if that isn't addressed until 3rd grade, it's an uphill battle for a while, because that's something you would want to catch around the same time as like a dyslexia that you'd want to catch that early on. So that's why really good teachers, or if you as a homeschooling parent, you should be checking for not only are they reading, how's that fluency going, all of that, but how much are they able to respond to you and comprehend what type of questions should you ask, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
But have to be checking for both. It's not just,
one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think too, without that accountability, then it becomes like they get so focused, right? On like, yeah, I'm going to read this so fast, or like the faster that I read it, then the sooner that I'm done, and that's it, right? And it's like, and so actually, just like a little side note. So with Owen, like he is one that I have to tell him often to like, hey, slow down, because he's like skipping over words and stuff like that. And sometimes I don't always want to be harping on him, like, you missed a word, like, go back, slow down, da da da. But like, if it's really impacting, or he's missed like a chunk, then I need to be like, you need to go back. But sometimes he'll like insert a word. He'll insert like an a or a the, or like, you know, he'll if it's a character talking, he might skip like she said and then go down, and he'll keep reading. But like, it's not necessarily that comprehension. When I ask, it's not impacting his comprehension. So I'm sort of just like, all right, you have some other things going on here, potentially, as far as like your impulsivity and stuff like that. I'm not super concerned. It's not getting to the point where you're reading so fast that it's impacting your ability to kind of understand what's happening in the story.
Yeah. And you also see, because you miss out with really like avid readers that are reading really fast, you miss out on a lot of conversations that would happen generally, like authentically, if the child wasn't as strong as of a reader. So for example, if you were reading a book with your child, and you know it's a new word and they're sounding it out, and then they're asking, well, what does that mean? And then you're talking about the word, so like you're building vocabulary at that moment. Well, if it's a really strong reader that's flying through the book, they've read the word, they're not stopping to, even though they don't know what the word is, but they've read it because they can't figure out how to read. So you're missing a beautiful moment there to do, you know, some vocabulary work, because and they're flying through the story. And so you do have to be, at times, I can remember I had a very high reading group of first graders one year, and I actually thought that it was harder than some of the other reading groups, because it was literally almost entirely kids that fit this description. They were off the chart readers, but getting them to comprehend what we were doing was I had to use all the strategies that we're going to talk about in a minute, because and I remember thinking, like, everyone used to joke with me that year about like, oh, you're so lucky, you've got the ones that are already reading. I'm like, yeah, they're already reading, but you know, that doesn't mean that they're comprehending it. And it had to go back to doing, you know, some of what a teacher or a reading specialist, if they're working with a reading specialist at this, although I would say that kids who have this disorder, comprehension, are less likely to work with a reading specialist, just because they can hold their own as far as like getting through the material in the classroom, even if they're, I hate to say it like that, but even if they're not comprehending it very well, they're less likely to be spotted and pulled out for an evaluation or any kind of work with a reading specialist. But so you have to be much more meticulous about like those interventions, like actually building up their vocabulary separate, because they may not be, or, you know, working on background knowledge aside from reading a piece. You do have to do a lot more explicit teaching with them about how to summarize, predict, question, making connections. I mean, you do that with all the kids, but again, sometimes you do it as you go in a story with a child, because you're reading it with them and they're pausing. And whereas when you've got a fast reader, they're flying through the whole thing without having stopped at all to think about or predict what's happening next, or because they're just going through the book.
Right. They're just excited that they can like
the story.
Read it. You know, and I read this whole big book, and it's my kids probably, if I had to pick one, not that I think they have like reading comprehension disorder, but like if I had to pick one that I think they struggle with, it would be this one, because they both are very fluent readers. But the other thing that I was going to say is, with your point about you know, the like missing the opportunity to talk about a word that maybe they don't know, I kind of have the same issue where like they aren't so willing, and we also have really gotten to it too much with like harder words, like to sit and decode a word that they come across. So like the other day we were reading Magic Treehouse Dinosaurs Before Dark. That's one of the books that we're doing for our little reading group, and the word in it is magnolia, like magnolia flowers, right? And so where we take turns reading it aloud, and I don't remember, I think it was Grace it was Alan that started, and he said like Mangola, something like that.
Yeah.
And just like breezed right by it. And I was like, "Oop, hold on, let's go back." And I took that opportunity just to try a little bit to see if he could kind of decode it. And again, we haven't gotten that part where we're like cutting words other than like 2-syllable words, but we're not looking at cutting patterns or anything like that yet. So I'm not too worried. But yeah, they come across some of these like really fluent readers. If they come across a word, they like look at it and they make their best guess and they move on. And it doesn't really, especially if they're not comprehending, they don't realize that doesn't make sense in that word. Or like, that's not a word. Like, what is that? So that's just like another little nuance. It's not like as obviously glaring a problem to have as a kid who might have dyslexia or whatever, but it does come with its own challenges. And I think just being aware that, even if you have a really fluent reader, this could be something that might crop up, that they are just so in a rush to finish and be done. And they might be really great and fluent readers and accuracy, but just to check for that comprehension.
And I would make a note too, just to say that, so dyslexia, we've talked about, reading fluency disorder, and now the reading comprehension disorder. None of these are disorders that are given to a child based off of poor instruction. Or these are all innate things that the child will come with regardless. That's why it fits into the disorder category. You might have a child who has some comprehension issues and doesn't have the disorder.
Right.
There are fluency issues, but does not have the fluency disorder. So that's just throw out there
instruction.
And then there is the number 4, which is kind of a mix, which is like kind of a mixed reading disorder that really kind of encompasses several components of the fluency and the comprehension, where not only are they still struggling to decode the words, but also comprehend. And you might think, oh, well, what's the difference between that and dyslexia? There is a big difference as far as when you do sit down with a kid, their ability to make progress at a faster rate when you've got that one-on-one versus a child with dyslexia. The progress will look very different. And not to mention, a kid with dyslexia would benefit from a completely different program and entry point into reading instruction, whereas a child who's just kind of got a mix of fluency and comprehension, it's a lot more practice and language comprehension work. And sometimes you might even add in the support of like a speech or language pathologist or special educator for that, but it wouldn't need to be the same level of instruction or separate instruction that's a child with dyslexia would have.
Right.
But that's why if you're at all concerned that your child might have a reading disorder, getting it checked out, getting them evaluated, you'll get a lot of information on, and that could also be an episode someday we go through like an evaluation of what it looks like, so that you get as a parent and how you read that, because it can be very jarring, and there's really only like 2 parts that you would need to look at to get a big comprehension of what it's all about. But regardless, there's usually a lot of recommendations in there. Even if your child's not given a formal diagnosis, they might say presents in this way or has, elements of this or whatnot, things that you could help target. And if you're a homeschooling parent, most of them you could probably target yourself as a homeschooling parent. Yeah. So the bonus kind of category that we were going to just mention briefly is that there are students that have reading issues and they are not a disorder, and that comes from other extenuating circumstances and factors that so these are completely separate from actually having a disorder that basically they were born with, to causes around them, like nature versus nurture. This is the nature of what they're in.
Nurture umbrella.
Like this is just so
environmental factors.
They stem from things like a lack of instruction or exposure. So these are kids who would be farther, but they haven't gotten good instruction, and that could be due to if they're in a classroom of who knows however many kids, and they're just kind of an average student, and so they're falling through the cracks. That happens. Or inconsistent schooling, they're out a lot, or there's just lots of different reasons why they might be missing key factors. I remember I had a student once in first grade who was out all the time. I just don't know if his mother cared so much. And it was, and I get taking your kid out to do, I always was like, keep your kid home if they're sick, as long as they need to do. But, taking off a month to go on a trip or something, it does impact, you can do whatever you want, you're the parent, but know that it's going to impact their progress in the classroom. And so, and a teacher can't always fix that, there's not much you can do. So that used to be a little pet peeve of mine when they expected like them to come back and be right where everybody else was. I'm like, no, you took the month of January off to go to Jamaica. Like, I'm sorry, they're not going to be
at homeschool.
Yeah, they're not going to be where they are. And like, that's not my fault.
Yeah.
So that that can cause a reading reading delays, the kid's behind, and that's an external factor that can happen. English language learners too, if English is a second language, and they're so they're learning the language and learning to read and write. That's the progress is gonna look different for them. You could probably speak to this one, but any attention disorders, sometimes even motivation difficulties, but like attention deficit disorders, if they have another type of behavioral issue going on, that's going to impact their ability to get the reading instruction. That's another huge issue. That's not a disorder of reading, but it's another struggle that they have that's going to impact their ability to get what they need to get out of reading instruction.
Right. Yeah. And I mean that first I might have misspoke before. Did we do 5 pillars of reading instruction first?
Yeah, that was the first one. That was the first one.
Okay.
Yes. No, you're right.
Okay, because we talk about why kids don't like to read?
Or that was the next one.
Okay, well I've got them mixed up. But anyway, so motivation.
You were right the first time around.
All right, I was right the first time.
Yes.
See, this is what happens when you homeschool and have kids and so so your motivation difficulties. I would reference that episode, which was episode 2, apparently.
Yeah. No.
Why kids don't want to read, right? And take a look at that one. If you're feeling like they're just not motivated, they're not interested, we did a whole episode on kind of, or a mini-sode on like how to help that, right? How to help the reluctant reader. And then your attention difficulties. Yeah, if your child has a formal diagnosis of ADHD, then you're going to need to come about it in a different way. And that's where some of the multisensory ways of learning, where it's not so much, tabletop work and just being a little bit more creative about how they're accessing their reading curriculum would be really helpful for that.
So a reading specialist is gonna distinguish between all the data and let you know if what the child has is a real reading disorder, through data observation and create an RTI, response to intervention plan, or there's these other factors play in as to why where it makes sense that they're at this point and that this is their attitude towards whatever. And you might even have, I've had students who before, like, you've got a child who's going through an incredibly painful situation at home, their parents are getting divorced or something, and they've made like no progress in reading for a month, and it's like, well, they've got life going on too, and they're people, they're little people, and so it's like there's lots of other things to factor in. And if you're homeschooling and you're uprooting your family and you're moving somewhere and you're setting up your house again, you may not make a whole lot of progress with your 7-year-old in reading because you've got a lot going on, and and that's okay. Table it and move on, but. Not a child's hesitancy or struggling with reading doesn't equate a reading disability.
I was just going to say the same thing.
Yeah, and you should jump to that conclusion.
Take a breath.
Take a breath.
If you're like panicking and thinking like, oh no, they have some sort of form, just take a breath. Just really. Maybe just pay a little bit more attention to what's going on. Maybe make a list of what are the areas that they're struggling with, what's going on, and then take it from there.
And I think what I'll do, rather than kind of read out through all of them, because this would just be a good thing, I can put it in the show notes underneath. But where it I broke down for you reading concerns by grade and age, and problematic, which is problematic because not all children will develop the same. So I put in big. I don't know if it'll show up on red, but these are general guidelines. This is not everybody. You might have a 4-year-old that is reading and a 9-year-old that's not. It's general. So this is from a collection of data worldwide of average kids at doing this is the average of a lot of kids. So there's outliers on both sides for sure. But just as far as early childhood age, the warning signs, things to look for, which we've kind of talked a little bit about, but I do list a few here. And the thing is that those warning signs that we talked about have to persist. It can't just be like, it was a struggle, but now we got it. Like, no, these are persistent ones that are not getting better, despite repeated regular instruction, exposure. Then you're kind of looking at raising a concern. You spend a lot of time, on trying to figure out how to make cat CAT and they're not getting it. I mean, that now you're looking at could be an issue. And then there's a similar set of signs for grades 1 through 2, and then upper elementary as well, things that you might want to think about when you are looking at your child's progress, and if you're thinking that you might be concerned. But again, these are general guidelines, and I will put them in the show notes for you to look at and read at your leisure versus just kind of reading and watching. Which brings us to the end of sort of what we were wanting to discuss for this episode, which is that you should be considering, especially if you're a homeschooling, parent and you've taken them out of that institution, is the developmental readiness of kids and how much that matters. And I know a lot of homeschooling parents that have taken their kids out of school because of that. They're like, I felt like they were pushed way too soon to expect, to be doing way too much. I thought kindergarten was going to be play and Play-Doh and this and that. And they're expected to read these, Bat the Cat books. And they were just like, and they're not ready yet. And that being a big, and so a lot of homeschooling parents feel that way, that it's like, it's a timeline. Your kids are, they're not, that is a problem with when you have to put them in a school system. And yes, you can try to nurture each child individually, but generally they are grouped in a grade with other kids the same age, and they're going to face the same, need to progress and standard. There's no way around that. And so that's often a reason for why families decide to homeschool. So, developmental readiness, it really matters. Some 4 or 5 year olds are ready to connect letters and sounds, and some are absolutely nowhere interested in it at all. Right. And pushing it too soon, you might do more damage than you realize.
Right, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, if you're starting it too soon, and this might be something, just in general in the classroom, like you said, in kindergarten, we're expecting these kids to be able to, start reading by the end of kindergarten. And that's just, some kids are just not ready, especially depending on when your child was born and all of that kind of stuff. And when, are they on the older end? Are they on the younger end? But yeah, then, there's some frustration there. They've experienced now their first reading experience, right? They've experienced failure. And so now reading becomes aversive and it's unpleasant and I'm not good at it. It just leads to a lot of other issues. So yeah, just really being aware that, developmental readiness does matter. And the luxury of homeschooling is that you really can be attuned to your child. And, if you're, a parent of a younger child and they're 4 and they're really interested in letters and letter sounds, great, capitalize on that. And but again, like Anna said, if they're showing no signs at all, then just, it's okay. Just back off a little bit. Certainly you can model, and we're never going to say don't be reading aloud. Just continue to have, books.
Always read.
And always model reading. And that's where that comprehension can come in and asking questions about what you're reading. But as far as this intensive, literacy instruction starting at, 4 or 5, they just might need a little bit more time. And I would rather give them the time and have them be, a little bit older and ready for it than to start it too soon. And now you're fighting this uphill battle where they don't like reading. It's hard for them, and it's just because it was started a little too soon.
Yeah. I mean, and I've had kids that have come to me, second grade level, third grade level, first grade. I mean, feeling like I'm a bad reader, I'm stupid. They have no confidence in this, at all. Any of the schoolwork gets bled over into other subjects as well. Now they've become more rambunctious in the classroom, or they're the class clown because they're supplementing in other ways. And you actually do. I mean, it's been proven. There's data on it that you do more damage to kids by enforcing reading instruction too early than by backing off and waiting and giving them more time. And in our history, I have a fun timeline I'm working on to do as an episode sometime that shows how reading instruction has changed since even just the 80s. I only went as far back as the 80s, and just to see the way it has changed is incredible. But I would say I think most kids that are the average kid in kindergarten is not ready to read. I mean, they're not. They might be some interest in letters and sounds and stuff too, but just because some are wanting to do it, great. But I don't think that that's the average, and unfortunately, I think that it's seen as the average, and it's the outlier who's not ready. And I think that that's incorrect. So, but again, you don't jumping to a child's reading disorder. There are a lot of parents that are jumping on hiring tutors or reading specialists, or wanting to get testing done because their kid isn't reading perfectly by the end of kindergarten. And I just sort of have to say, it's hard to, what do you say? So, they shouldn't be.
Right,
and, you got to give them some more time, and it doesn't matter what their classmate is doing, or, I do another beauty of the homeschool is not sitting next to a child who's, they're comparing themselves to, which is nice. But, there's a lot that goes into a child's ability to read, and most of them are not a disorder that you need to seek intervention for. Most of them are not.
Right.
There are many that are, but most of them are not. So, we had thrown in here just some other big factors behind the rise in readiness issues, because it's in the news. If you look up information about schools, data reports, you're always hearing. Yeah, you're always hearing this.
30% proficient in reading.
Yeah, so and that a lot of that accounts for the world that we live in right now, or the way our society is. Inconsistent, weak reading instruction. You've got teachers that are, and rightly so, some of them that have gone on strike, or are overwhelmed in the classroom, and are inconsistent even in their being there, or they're in a classroom one day and in a different classroom the next day. There's not the same consistency in a lot of schools with the teacher doing the same instruction day after day the way it used to be.
There's just so many other things that are going on too. And I know we were talking a little bit before we jumped on for the episode, is just like, when I was a special ed teacher in a self-contained classroom, I had 4th and 5th graders, and I would get kids coming into me 4th grade that they could not decode. And it was not because they had a formal diagnosis. It was just they had spent 3rd grade, 2nd grade, 1st grade, kindergarten in a substantially separate classroom for kids with behavior and social emotional issues, and the priority in the classroom was safety and wellness. And so much of their school day was color this picture, and there was never, and even if there was any attempt at any sort of reading instruction, it was very minimal and choppy at best. And so they never had anybody to sit down and explicitly teach them this. And now you're in 4th grade and you can't read, and it's not anything that was their fault. So I think and regular education classrooms are experiencing this as well. How many behaviors do you have in your classroom? How many times are you calling for backup because a kid is having a meltdown? For they could have no social emotional diagnosis. It's just whatever they're coming from at home, and coping skill, and so many other things that teachers are dealing with, and that interrupts not only that child's instruction, but also the instruction of the, however many other 20, I'm going to say 20, it's probably more, kids that are in the classroom as well. So just, it's not, this one feels like maybe, and we don't mean it this way, like, oh, they had inconsistent or weak reading instruction because the teachers were not great. No, usually it's another reason why. There's other factors going on, and the teachers are trying, but it's just... There's only so much that you can kind of manage, and safety obviously should be the main priority. But
and I think most teachers would rather be in their classroom teaching their class, day after day. It's just having been around in that, there's times you're pulled because they need coverage for this or that, or you've got a group that you didn't expect because they're not your normal group, or you've got your group but another teacher's out and they have no sub, so now that group has joined your group and you can't do the instruction you would for your group. Teachers are dealing with a lot, and it's not fair to put it's not fair to put it all on them, because it's the institution, it's the higher ups in the school that are delegating this way, and it's not the teacher's fault. Less exposure to rich oral language, vocabulary. There's a lot less conversation in homes nowadays because of the next one, which is increased screen time. Families just aren't having the conversations that they used to have because kids are on screens or watching.
Or parents are on screens.
Your parents are on screens. Right. Or you're watching TV with your meal, and so you're not talking. They're just not getting as much of that back and forth. Post-pandemic, learning disruptions are still affecting kids who were in certain grades when that hit. And foundational skills were really missing at that point. And we talked about growing class size, limited intervention resources. There's fewer intervention, interventionists out there doing this work, and the ones that are, I think, are very much bombarded by kids who have reading challenges and are struggling, but don't actually have a disorder. Reading specialists used to be mostly dealing with the kids who have a diagnosed disorder. Now it's like, well, they can't keep pace with the class, so they're going to go to the reading specialist. So the reading specialist who should be working with like 3 is now working with 6. And that makes a big difference when you're doing really explicit practice.
Especially for those kids that have the diagnosis, because as we talked about, this is dyslexia. It needs that one-on-one, explicit instruction, because that's where you can make the most progress. And again, that is a nice thing about homeschooling, is that you can do that, with your child, whether you have one or whether you have more than that. You can carve out the time to sit and do one-on-one instruction, and even if it's not a disorder, just to you could just maximize your time on learning, which is like a big catchphrase. You could definitely maximize your time on learning at home, and then just get it done and move on to the next thing, and your child is able to make a little bit more progress than worrying about maybe like a mix and match intervention that's happening in school for whatever reason. So
good point. So I mean, our goal for this episode was really to hopefully give you some insight into reading disorders and challenges, but to hopefully guide you. And if you're worrying about your child, when there are times that it's just a delay, or and when you should start to worry about it, or when you don't need to worry about it, or not to the level where you need to get an intervention, but where you need to sort of back off or breathe, or maybe switch up what you're doing a little bit. But it's not a disorder. The disorders are a different category, different intervention practice, and so hopefully we've parsed that out for you a little bit, so that you can, if you're thinking about your child and you're worried about their reading progress, and what you're doing with them, and do I need to seek support or an assessment or something, hopefully we've given you some useful ways of thinking about that.
If anyone has any like specific questions too, I think you can message on our Facebook group.
We have a Facebook group. The Graded Escape is on Facebook. It's also on Instagram, and even through the YouTube channel. On any episode that we post, there is spots for comments, and so I check those. And if there's a comment that has a question that you'd like us to address about,
if you're like really concerned about something, and you want to I think you can post anonymously, right? Like so if you're really like wanting some more information but feeling a little bit, I don't know, wary about putting it out there in the universe, you can always leave like an anonymous, comment on our Facebook page, and we'll happily, message you back and give you a little bit of guidance and support on where to go next. That's like the biggest thing I know we've mentioned in so many episodes. The nice thing about homeschooling is that you do have this community of people that all come from lots of different experiences, and so if we can help a little bit to maybe quell some of your fears or anxiety about what is going on with your learner, and just offer some support, we're happy to do that.
Yes, that's our goal. So stay tuned. We have our last episode coming up of the 4-part series on reading, which is about reading comprehension and critical thinking and how you do it, which you may want to be really watching if you've watched this one, because we just talked about how important it is that you're checking on a child's ability to think about what they're reading. So that is upcoming. But until then, we hope that you keep the lessons light and the moments meaningful. Excuse me. Thank you for escaping with us.